In this tutorial, we're going to be testing a use case and seeing problems that we might encounter and how to fix them. First, let's check out the use case that we have here. First, we have in the constructor injection of a repository, and then we're going to be using this repository to just send some request. Then we have an execute function, which takes two parameters, which is username and password. What we're returning from it, it's a flow. And inside of it, as we can see, when we enter, we're first emitting a loading state, and then we're emitting, when we have a success message, the data that we want to return, or if we have an error message, just an exception. Inside of it, we have one more thing, and this is before we pass the credentials to the repository, we're actually converting them to Base64 encode, and then we pass them, if they're not null. So let's see how we can test this use case. Even though the code is not that big, I can assure you that we can have a lot of issues, and it might be a problem if we don't know how to handle them. First, before anything, we're going to be initializing our annotations for Mockk, because it will be easier for us if we want to mock something. So what that means is, first, when we want to use our annotations for our Mockk, because we're using the Mockk library, we need to initialize them like this. Just mock annotations.init, and then we're passing this. And now every time we want to use the annotations, we can access them. So we would like to mock our general repository, and we're going to be initializing it later. Then we have our use case, but we don't want to mock it because we're going to be handling everything ourselves. And we have just a global result over here because it will be easier to test it like this. And you'll see why in a bit. Then we have our use case over here. So this means that every time we would like to return the use case, we're calling the produce use case function, which is going to be creating the use case for us. So this is just easier way of us creating a use case. Now let's check what's happening here. Because we have Base64 encoding in our use case, what we have to do is actually mock that Base64. And this is for anything that we're using from the Android SDK, we need to mock it. And that's required because the tests by themselves, they do not know that Base64 actually exists or what it does. Because this is just a SDK specific thing. So the functionality of Base64 that we're using here, it only lives on the device itself. So the code actually doesn't know what our Base64 is going to do. And that's why whatever we have, we need to mock it. And one more thing, because Base64 is static by itself, we need to mock it with mock static. And that's why we have mock static at the top. So let's see what's happening then. Because we're calling Base64 encode to string, and as we said, this is just an Android SDK function. We don't know about it, so we're just saying that every time we call this, we would like actually to execute the Java Base64 encode to string. And how do we know what we pass as a value? We have slots. So as we can see here, we have array slot that we're passing to our encode to string. So you can imagine that this is the variable that we're going to be passing. And when we want to use it, we're just going to be using the array slot.capture. So this is just how we pass our variable to the encode to string, and then we capture it. So you can imagine that this is your encoded username, for example, or password. And then we're using that, value over here. The same thing goes for the other capture, which is going to be for a string, because we have for byte array and for string. And this is how we actually can mock the Base64 class. And one more thing, as you can see, we can do it globally in this test case, and we're doing it by passing before over here, and this is a how function. So every time before every test case, we're going to be having this Base64. And every time that we're expecting this to be called, it doesn't matter on which test case, it's actually going to be working because we're mocking it over here. Now let's see one of the test cases. And the first one is we're going to be just passing no values to the user and the password. And then because we're using mock, we would like to say that when we're running the repository login function, we would like to return the success message. Now we're not interested in actual success message in this case, but we're just returning something here. Now, as we saw before, we have the produce use case, so we're creating our use case. And when we create the use case, we're just saying use case.execute. We're passing our parameters, and then we're using a library that's called Turbine. And Turbine just makes things easier for us when we're working with flows. So in our case, we would like to run the flow, and because execute is a flow, we're just saying testing and we're passing the background scope. And we're getting the background scope from the runTest. Before you might have been using run background test, but the current one, which is usable and which is not deprecated, is runTest. And this is actually how we should run the tests that we have. And then we want to verify that the values that were passed were null. So when we execute our flow over here, inside of it, we know that it has the general repository function that's going to be executed, which is the login one. And then we are expecting it to be null. And that's why we're checking here and verifying that if it's null. And if it is, the test should be successful. As we can see, it is. If we can see the next one, we have something that's very similar to it, but we're passing some data this time to the email, password, and credentials. That's why when we pass the call every function, we can see that over here we're checking for anything that's being passed to the login. We also have a check for the credential functions in the use case, which we're passing the email and password, and we're returning just some credentials, and then we're starting the flow. The finishing part is we're verifying that whatever we have in the login, it is not null. So that's the idea of this use case, that if we pass some values, the login function will not be null. Let's see the next one. And again, we have some similarities over here, but what we're interested in is the use case execute. And here you can see that we're doing it a bit differently. We would like to check actually, because it's a flow, we would like to get the emitted values from that flow. And again, we're using Turbine, and as we can see, we're having this receive Turbine here because we're using this function that's called .test. When you're using .test, this means that we're executing our function, our flow, and then we can receive the emitted items. And we're doing it by just calling await item. So the first time we're awaiting item, of course, is going to be the first result, and we're checking if the first result is data state loading. And in our case, we always know that it is data state loading because every time we enter the execute function, it is going to be emitting this as a first value. So after we check the first item, we can check the second one as well. Again, just typing await item. And when we check it, depending on what the result will be, we'll have data state data or data state error. So in our case, we're going to be returning some results here, like we did before, but we didn't check for it. And now in this test, we're going to be checking if the results is actually something or an error. And in our case, we're returning something. That's why we'll be having the data state data. And when we know that this will be our last result, then we say await complete to just say that we're not expecting anything else. So when we run it, our test should be successful. Yep. And let's see the last one. We're having almost the same thing, but this time we would like to return an error. So we're creating a fake exception, and when we're executing the login function, we're just returning the request result error. So this means when we check the flow, the first item again will be loading, but the second item will be data state error. We're checking then if the exception is the same exception that we actually have over here in our test call every, and then we're saying await complete because we're not waiting for anything else to be emitted. As you see, we run a couple of tests and we run different scenarios that you can encounter and the ways you can solve it. So I hope you liked it, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more.